We can try that one more time. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Excellent. Welcome, everybody. This is the fourth of four Bishop Nominee Forums, and we want to begin by saying thank you to the people and pastor of Incarnation Lutheran who have opened up their doors for all of us this evening. We give you thanks. My name is Arthur Berggren. I serve as the lead pastor of Lutheran Church of the Resurrection in Racine, Wisconsin, and I am here as the moderator and as a member of the Bishop's task force for these events. Please be aware that our ground rules are very simple. There'll be questions that'll be asked, and they'll be given a time frame. There is a timer up front who will help the nominees see those times. And tonight, also please be aware that for the first half of this, the questions will come from the task force. But in the second half of this, you'll be given out a white index card, and if you have a question, we won't be able to get to all of them. Frankly, we'll be able to get to maybe 3, but we'll select from those questions to share. Immediately afterwards, there'll be a chance for you to visit with these nominees out in the narthex, so to have individual conversation and have a chance to be with them. Please also be aware that you can find on milwaukeesynod.org, our synodical website, the complete listing of each one of these candidates' nomination forms. So we invite you to take a peek at that. I believe those are the fullness of our announcements, and we'll now begin with a word of prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Holy God, we give you thanks for these 8 gifted souls who have allowed their name to move forward to contemplate and to pray and to discern a call to the office of bishop. We thank you for our outgoing Bishop Jeff, and we ask that you would bless the person for whom you will call. We ask that you bless each and every one of these souls tonight. Fill them with the good things of your grace as they share with us their thoughts and their hearts and the theology that all of us need to learn and grow into. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. We've had one question that we begin each and every time, and we're going to repeat it. It's for each of the candidates to have a chance to introduce themselves and to share with all of you their favorite Bible scripture. And this is 3 minutes, and we'll begin with Pastor Jennifer.
Good afternoon and evening. I guess it's already the evening. I'm Jennifer Thomas. I am the gift officer and alumni relations person from the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. I've been serving on the seminary staff for 1.5 years. That is the seminary I graduated from in 1998, and my first call was here in this synod at Lake Park Lutheran Church. I was co-pastors with David for 9 years, and this is the synod that formed and shaped me, my sense of mission and pastoral identity, the priorities that I've brought with me into ministry, to care for God's people and to advocate for justice. My second call was to Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Kansas City in the Central State Synod, where I was for 7 years, doing a lot of the similar type of work of redeveloping a congregation with different results. But in that time, I grew as a pastor. I had the opportunity to supervise staff and to supervise interns, and in that began to serve in larger church roles as a volunteer, both here in the Synod and in Central State Synod. I have experience as a council member both at the Synod level and the ELCA, and while on the ELCA Church Council, I was on the Blue Ribbon Committee for Mission Funding that still is used today to shape and guide how we do mission funding from the local congregation all the way through church-wide organization funding of those priorities that we value together. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. My favorite Bible verse is from the story of the Good Samaritan, when Jesus says that we are called to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves, and that's what guides me in ministry. I love the church. I'm passionate about people. I find these experiences overwhelming because I'm asked to talk about me, and my favorite part about ministry is hearing your stories, and I like to find out how our stories are connected into God's narrative and how God's narrative is shaping our world, the church, and what we're called to do together in the future. Thank you for this opportunity.
Good evening. My name is Harvard Stevens Jr., and I'm really thrilled to be here. I have a really interesting story to tell and don't have time to tell it. So I'll just start with some things that you may not know. I'm a third-generation Lutheran pastor. My grandfather was Lutheran pastor. My father was pastor, and I was baptized by my dad in Birmingham, Alabama at St. Paul Lutheran Church, which your colleague Joe Ellwanger has written about a lot in some of his books. I grew up in Robbins, Illinois, in a place where it was a pretty much all-black community. But in that parish, 4 Lutheran pastors emerged, including the first woman who was African-American, who was ordained a Lutheran in North America. I'm happy to have lived through a lot of history in the sense that I moved to Detroit at the age of 16, 4 months before Dr. King's assassination, and witnessed firsthand the tumult and the difficulty of finding healing in that place. My college was at Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, student movement happening all over the place. My first congregation, I was ordained Metro New York Synod, by the way, and my father's last parish was in the South Bronx. I began my ministry in inner city Baltimore, and then in inner city Columbus, Ohio, and then to the U.S. Virgin Islands as the first black pastor of Frederick Lutheran Church, a congregation celebrating its 350th year this year. And I was pastor number 99. So that says something about how long their ministry has extended. I'm also glad to say that I've had the experience of being a mission developer, starting a congregation with my wife and a great team that is still going in Prince George's County, Maryland. Campus ministry at Howard University, and as many of you know, at Carthage College, which is what brought me to Wisconsin. And then after a brief return back to the Virgin Islands, I do like the beach, I have to tell you, but after all of that, I'm now serving at LSTC, Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. We are colleagues there. I'm Dean of Chapel and pastor to the community. I work with young adults almost every day of my life. I'd love to say more about that. Nice to see you.
Good evening. My name is Joy Mortensen Wiebe, and I currently serve St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Mayville as their interim pastor. Been doing that for 4 weeks. So prior to that, I was at here in the Greater Milwaukee Synod at St. Paul's, I just said that, Living Hope in Saukville, near the Port Washington area. And I thought about how I would introduce myself when we first began these forums, and what kept coming back to me as a theme was how much the Greater Milwaukee Synod was a part of my formation as well. When I went to college, I chose Carroll College, not Carroll University, Carroll College, because they gave me more money than the Lutherans did, quite honestly. The Presbyterians ponied up more money, so I went off to Carroll College out in Waukesha. And when I got there, the student body was about 40% Wisconsin Synod Lutherans. And that wasn't a very good fit for me as a young aspiring pastor. So I went to the person in the religion department, his name is Lamar Cope, and he hooked me up with a church out in Waukesha, Christ the Servant. And Christ the Servant Lutheran Church became a refuge for me. It opened up the whole community to me. Pastor Rick Engen at the time took me under his wing, mentored me about how to become, and I was learning from them. Later on, I would go to a Lutheran study tour, and Sandy Jacobs was on that tour. He has no idea I'm name dropping him, and have been the last 3 forums, but I learned from watching so many people and being mentored. So when I thought about how do I introduce myself to all of you, I'd introduce myself by saying thanks, because you mentored in me faith as a young adult. So that's what I would say first. My previous calls to my most recent experience with you here in the Greater Milwaukee Synod include 10 years of serving as the Director of Evangelical Mission and the Associate with the Bishop in the East Central Synod, where I was in charge of candidacy, assembly, the endowment, and many other hats that I wore. And I've also served as the person that follows the mission developer along with my husband at All Saints in Oshkosh, where we did many wonderful things and had a lot of fun in ministry together. So that's a little bit about me this evening, and I'm grateful to be here, and thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lindsey Jordan, pastor out at Christ the King Lutheran in Delafield, out in the West. It's good to be with all of you. I'm a pastor that has served in the church now since 1989, doing ministry full-time most of the time. I've been ordained since 1995. I started out first as a youth director in Albuquerque, New Mexico, serving also in the city in St. Paul, Minnesota, in an urban setting. I have had opportunities to serve out in Pennsylvania, being a part of the Northwestern Pennsylvania Synod, a small congregation in a community that was experiencing a lot of what we're going through in our churches now, but that was 20 years ago. And seeing interesting patterns that we were experiencing back then happening now right in our congregations around us. After spending time in Pennsylvania, my wife and I found calls in the La Crosse area. I served in a congregation right north of La Crosse, a small church by the name of Halfway Creek Lutheran outside of Holmen, Wisconsin. And that's the kind of place that has a building out back that they call their lutefisk shed. And if you don't know what lutefisk is, thank God. But I can tell you it was always the second week of October, and it drew a lot of ladybugs. It was something. From there I went down to Viroqua, Wisconsin, which was an eclectic community south of La Crosse, a town of 4,500 that I was really eager to get into because of the diversity of thought. It was a community that in many ways felt like some of the richest cultural areas that I've been in Albuquerque or Santa Fe or in St. Paul, and there it was in a small town. 2 years ago I came this way receiving a call out in Delafield, and so I've been there now and rejoicing with those people for a couple of years. I grew up in Iowa. I was in a small community. That is a congregation that shaped me greatly as a pastor and as an individual. Baptized at Fertile Lutheran in Fertile, Iowa. And isn't that a great name? I have been greatly shaped by that faith that has been planted deep within me through the Holy Spirit and nurtured. And I'm thrilled to be here tonight. For Scripture, I always lean on Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where is my help to come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And I really believe that's a motto that we need to keep returning to in times of transition, in times of uncertainty in the church, that the one who creates and sustains is the same one that will see us through. So thank you for your time tonight.
Good evening. My name is Paul Erickson, and I currently serve as the director of a ministry called Agora, located in St. Paul, Minnesota. Agora is housed at Luther Seminary, and we provide education for lay leaders of immigrant and multicultural congregations. I've been doing that for a couple of years now. Let me go back to the beginning of the journey. I grew up in this synod. I was a member of, my dad was pastor at St. Matthew's in Wauwatosa, and also at Bethel in Muskego. Went away to college in Minnesota. I learned Spanish in Mexico. Ended up in Chicago for seminary, and my first call was there. And then I returned to Milwaukee as an adult and served for 9 years as a pastor at Faith Santa Fe Lutheran Church. That's where I met my wife, Lynn, who is now also a pastor, serving up in West St. Paul, Minnesota. Our two kids, David and Sarah, were born here as well, and now David's in college and Sarah's in high school, and I'm exploring this as a wonderful opportunity to return to a place that I love and serve in communities that I love. After leaving Milwaukee in 2003, was called to serve as associate pastor at Augustana Lutheran Church in West St. Paul. After 5 years there, I served on Bishop Peter Rognus' staff in the St. Paul Area Synod as the assistant to the bishop for Evangelical Mission, where I worked with urban and ethnic and new and renewing congregations. Also facilitate our global partnership with the church in Guatemala. So I've traveled a lot there. And I've been greatly shaped by the ELCA's understanding of accompaniment, of walking with one another in faith. And that leads me to the scripture passage that has always been a lot to me. Micah chapter 6, verse 8. God has shown you, O people, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? When I was young in ministry, I felt the call to do justice, to make things right. And I knew what was right. And I was going to tell everyone what they needed to be about. I quickly learned, however, that folks don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So I learned the importance of loving mercifully and to listen and to hear the stories of people that I would walk with and work with in ministry, especially people that I might not agree with at the beginning. But through hearing the stories and walking with and learning to love the people that God places in front of me, one at a time, we can make a difference in the world. And then as I have grown older in years, I've learned the importance of walking humbly with our neighbor and with our God. We are on a journey together in God's great world, and there's an old African proverb that says, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I believe that God is calling us into a new path to walk far into whatever future God holds for us, building communities of justice, compassion, and hope. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I'm Pastor David Dragseth, pastor at Lake Park over on the east side for 17 years. I started the morning early. It was 5:30 a.m. and I was out rowing on the Milwaukee River. It was totally dark, and as I made my way down the river and made it to the junction where the Menominee comes in, the sun, it rose, and there was a moment where I had to stop and just look at the beauty of the river this morning in spring and the beauty of the city of Milwaukee. I had to pause because I don't take it for granted at all, because the river and the city was not always that way down there. 19 years ago, I remember rowing through the midst of the city and a recliner was floating down the river, and I actually hit it in the boat. I remember seeing deep poverty and violence, and one morning, even a death as I was rowing. It's hard because you don't realize how much our city of Milwaukee has changed until you've been here for a long time, like I have, and lived in it. The city, our Sunrise City, has changed an enormous amount. And everything about what has led to that change, that resurrection in our city, is almost impossible to share in 2 and 3 minute sound bites. Tonight will be difficult for all of us because we're going to try to heave all of who we are into little snippets, and it will be impossible to do. Everything about what I know about being a reformer, a leader, a pastor is different than this kind of format, because everything about what really brings about the difference between this morning and 20 years ago is you, the capacity to listen and learn from you. At Lake Park, the beauty of walking and being with you is really what's led and transformed our ministry together. I mean, it helped us connect with campus ministry, with Urban Ecology Center, with Reconciling Christ Ministries, El Salvador Ministries. Ultimately, the privilege of staying put in one place and working with you a long time together as your pastor and friend has been what's made the difference. And so my favorite Bible passage from John, I've no longer called you servants, I have called you friends. It's my privilege to have been friends with you. Thanks.
Good evening. I'm Sandy Krastowski. I currently serve on our Synod staff as Director for Evangelical Mission for the last 6 years. I've been a pastor in our Synod for the past 23 years. Before these years, I served at Galilee Lutheran Church in Pewaukee, first as the associate and then called as the senior pastor, a total of 16 years of service there. Prior to that, I served as interim pastor at Emmaus Lutheran Church in Racine while waiting my first call. And prior to that, I served in a first career as a registered occupational therapist. So I very much see God at work in healing our bodies, and healing our souls, our minds, our hearts, and healing communities of people and neighborhoods and cities as well. My favorite passage is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 43. Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. It is about to spring forth. Do you not perceive it? I am doing something new, God is telling us. And I think God is always doing something new in Jesus Christ. As one who continues to pour new wine into old wineskins, to equip us in new and different ways, to stretch us beyond our comfort zones, to call us to new adventures beyond what we can even imagine, and to be a part of God's dream for our world and for society. So I'm grateful for this call. I served before this call, I served, as I said, in the parish, but this call has been very important for me because it's been accompanying congregations in new mission starts and new expressions of ministry, in revitalization and redevelopment of congregations so they can see a new pathway forward, and also educating people about how to be faithful steward leaders and how do we take the abundance of what God has given us and give it back for the sake of the church and for the world, and also educating congregations and leaders about mission support as well. So it's been a broad sweep of many ministries together, but it's been a privilege and a blessing. Thank you.
It works. I'm Lisa Bates Froyland, and I'm currently pastor at Redeemer Lutheran Church on Wisconsin Avenue, and I've been there for 5 years now. It's a turning around congregation in the city. We've had a lot of great joy that's been shared in the last 5 years as we do ministry in new ways. I grew up in small towns in Minnesota, Wadena and Little Falls, Minnesota. I was raised by a teacher and a bookkeeper. And once I was 18 years old, I headed off to St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, and then on to Indiana University, where I earned a master's degree and a doctorate in speech communication. I'm married to David, who is an attorney. Don't hold that against him. You didn't say your thing about no jeering tonight. So no jeering. And 2 daughters. Betsy is 16 and a sophomore at Whitefish Bay High School, and my daughter Maddie is finishing up her freshman year at St. Olaf College. We moved to Milwaukee 18 years ago. I taught at Mount Mary College, now university, but college, and at UWM communication courses. I serve on the Synod Council currently, and also on the Wisconsin Council of Churches Peace and Justice Commission, and on the Siebert Foundation's Change or Die Conference, alongside other leaders of Wisconsin Synod and Missouri Synod, the first clergy woman called to that task force. I think for this synod, if I were bishop, elected bishop, I would bring to it the 4 dynamics that have meant the most for our turning around at Redeemer. A place that when I started there was worshiping on average 35 people per Sunday. We have more than doubled that in the last 5 years. So something's going on there, and it's listening to God and following the yeses, knowing that problems are normal, and figuring out creative ways to solve them. But the 4 dynamics, number 1 is communication. I think that our attentiveness to communication is so important. And I do mean the media technologies and social media on the synodical level, as well as just very careful and honest communication using a new language. The thing about Redeemer is that the first pastor there in 1890 came with a radical idea that they could worship in English. So I think now it's also time for a new way of communicating and being church. The other dynamics would be connections. We have prospered so well from creative connections that I hope I get to talk about later on. The third is caretaking, the less sexy side of stewardship. You know, there's generosity and there's caretaking, and I'm passionate about caretaking. And finally, Christ at the center of it all, always. Always. Thank you. Thank you, Incarnation Lutheran, for hosting us tonight.
Pastors, the next question, and it'll be 3 minutes, is how do you understand the bishop's role as the public voice for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the greater Milwaukee Synod? When you're ready, Pastor.
Well, the bishop's role, that's going to take a few minutes. I didn't give my Bible verse earlier. Jesus asked the question, who do you say that I am? And to me, that's the verse, because it says a lot about the bishop's role. It says a lot about all of our shared ministry. It's not just about who Jesus is. It's not getting the theology and Christology right, but it's about the witness that we offer as a church and how people experience us as ambassadors for Christ, to whom has been entrusted a ministry of reconciliation. I think that the bishop has to be willing to use the office to build relationships that are accessible, because you are the bishop. I live in the city of Kenosha. I can go see the school superintendent. I can go see any of the college presidents. I know most of the business owners. I know most of the school principals. I'm able to connect with them in a way that helps my ministry. And I think that the bishop here has to be in connection with the people who represent the civic life as well as the ecumenical life of this part of Wisconsin. I also believe that one's own faith is a part of how one expresses and articulates the faith that we share, which includes our questions, the questions that we need to own and recognize and make better questions, so that we can therefore respond as the Holy Spirit moves us to speak to this world, to speak to this community. Milwaukee and greater Milwaukee has significant issues. There are demographics that put us at the bottom of a lot of profiles about outcomes, about how people of color live, their possibilities, about segregation, about issues of poverty and wealth. And there's a lot that we can do as a church to not necessarily say we are politicians, but we are the church. And in our identity, because of our baptism and the foundation that it gives us, we can speak to communities as a healing presence, as an advocating voice, and as one that has wisdom about the resources of this church. It should not be hidden to the world that Lutherans are a global communion. People should know that the Lutheran World Federation is articulating a sense of identity that pertains to our work here and now. That this anniversary of the Reformation, this 500th year, has everything to do with our own renewal in this time and in this place. Who do you say that I am? It starts there. Thank you.
Would you mind reading that one more time?
Not at all. How do you understand the bishop's role as the public voice of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America for the Greater Milwaukee Synod?
So I think that word public voice is very important, because the bishop has constitutional duties of word and sacrament and leadership and vision, but as public voice of a synod, which is the bishop's level in synod, we exist in three expressions: the congregational level, the church-wide level, and the synodical level. So as public voice, a bishop in a synod communicates and is always translating between congregation and church-wide. So the bishop is the public face and voice, bringing and helping articulate to congregations what is all the amazing stuff that's happening at church-wide. What does church-wide do? What are the amazing programs that we do around the world? What is our outreach? Where does your mission support dollars go when we turn over 52% or 50% over to church-wide? What good is that doing around the world? So how does your bishop, how would I as your bishop articulate that to you in a meaningful way, so that people who are sitting around congregational council tables don't just go, we have a bishop? Or what is we church-wide? There's more than just us? Because I'm afraid that happens. I know that happens. I've gone into congregations as a staff member of a synod, and there's not always understanding of our wider church structure. So as a public voice of a synod, as a bishop, a synodical bishop, it's my job to articulate all of the amazing, wonderful things and programs that our ELCA church-wide structure does throughout the world. Because we do amazing good together. We are stronger together. We exist in three expressions for the good of the world. We're not just one singular silo of individual congregations, but we're church together. And it's my job as a synodical bishop to articulate. And it's also my job, going up the other way, the Lift report of our church, Living into the Future Together, a few years ago said that it's very important for us to always be articulating that mission happens in congregations. And how do we articulate that down and help congregations with faith formation do their work better? And so then my job as the public voice and public face becomes, how do I help articulate that to church-wide? so that we're not just this top down, bottom up, but how do we become more of a circle? How do we become more of an entity that supports each other? And the public face and public voice becomes one that gets so skilled at supporting and being unified and being for the sake of the world together. With our programs, with our theology, with the desire to be inclusive and reaching out. We have amazing programs in the Greater Milwaukee Synod to share with one another. And part of that being a public voice is to make sure everybody knows about it.
In 2009, when our ELCA church-wide assembly decided to take some votes on sexuality issues, I was camping in Michigan at the time and watching eagerly the news. And when the momentous vote came to pass the proposal set before the church-wide assembly, I took out my phone and I started typing a letter to my congregation, knowing that it would be 2 weeks before I would be back. Knowing that on an important day like that, the voice of the pastor of that congregation needed to speak pastorally from the point of view of love, challenging my people to hear the call of the Spirit. I think a bishop does much of the same. A bishop steps into the world and says, in this platform where I represent many people, I can speak to the deepest pains of the world, and I can give a prophetic voice that helps give witness to the Christ who brings healing and the Spirit that is continuing to bring communities together and bringing reconciliation and healing where there is pain, where there is brokenness. It's not lost on me that one of the first things that Bishop Eaton did in her time together was she said, let's have a conversation about racism. And so she said, we're going to hold a town hall meeting and we're going to invite congregations into it. I didn't find out about it in time to get my whole congregation involved, but we've listened to the recording afterwards. The public voice of pastor and bishop is extremely important. We have a gospel to proclaim in the midst of brokenness in this world, that God is always standing on the side of life, and having access as a bishop to leaders in the community, as Harvard was saying so well, you can go and you can talk about this in a way where the representative that you're talking to knows that you stand there on behalf of not just you as an individual, but a whole body of 130 congregations together in ministry. And so when there is discrimination happening against Muslims, we can stand up and say this kind of rhetoric is not helpful. And as a leader in the religious community, my public voice would be to stand on the side of the gospel that calls us always to be working toward the life of Christ for the sake of the world. I think that's a very honorable thing and a privilege that the bishop has. And if elected, I would enjoy exercising that.
The first dimension, in my understanding of being a public voice, which is very similar to, I think, what a pastor is called to do in a congregation. This is, of course, on a different level. The first step is really listening to what is going on in the hearts and the lives of people in the Greater Milwaukee Synod. Gathering those together and then giving those voice in the forums that bishops sometimes have access to that other folks don't. And get ears to listen to us that other folks might not. But to be able to have that voice be reflective of the voices of the folks in the Greater Milwaukee Synod. And so to be in relationship with them and to walk with them and to feel their pain and to understand the joys and the struggles that folks have in these communities. I was a part of Micah here in Milwaukee and Isaiah in Minnesota, church-based community organizing networks. And I've seen the great power that can happen when people come together. So it's not just one individual going into a room by themselves to talk to another individual, but there's a whole community of folks standing with and standing behind that leader who is called to speak. So I think the bishop has a privilege and an opportunity and a great responsibility to make sure that the voice, the concerns that he or she is giving voice to are reflective of the community. I think there's another way in which the voice of a bishop's office can be used, and that is among the congregations. Oftentimes, it's so easy to get tied up in the details of congregational life. And we, just like a pastor on a Sunday morning, needs to call people again to the central themes of the gospel so that we can be energized to return to our lives with renewed energy and vision. I think the role of the bishop is to remind all of us of the core values of what it means to be God's people. We live in a world that is divided. We live in a world that is ruled by fear and by hatred, and it is our job as the church to call people into our better selves and to recognize that we all are connected in deep and profound ways, even at the same time we are all distinct. Each and every person has their own unique story. And we as a church, I think, have a unique role to play in this greater society of changing the conversation, of not getting sucked into the right, left, black, white, Muslim, Christian divides, but to find a new way to express how we are all God's people and we are all created to make this world a better place for our sisters and brothers. So calling us forth into that vision and helping us live out that vision day to day is an honor and a privilege, both as a parish pastor and even more so perhaps as a synodical bishop. Thank you.
Your question again, how can the bishop be a public voice for the ELCA? I love how Luther turned that around in the Reformation. A leader's role is not to be a voice for the church. A leader's role is to be a voice for God's people. And out of that, a church is formed. A public voice, I love what Pope Francis has done with the public voice for the Roman Catholic Church. How right away in the very beginning he turned it around so that there was this reminder that the church was there as a public voice fundamentally for people and the sufferings of God's people in the world. Luther talked about reform happening and the need in reforming communities, that if you wanted to change politics and wanted to change society, first needed to send in a preacher, because a preacher could get under what was really corrupting the societal systems of the time. 30% poverty rate, 40% child poverty rate, 50% incarceration of African American men 30 and under in our city. What gets under that and changes that is a fundamental critique of the worldviews that lead to that. So Luther said, look, if we're baptizing little girls and little boys together, we need to have education together for little girls and little boys. If we are communing men and women together of different social strata, we cannot have divided culture and societies. If we in Christ know there is no distinction, it is not okay for there to be distinction in our world. A public leader says that and lets the reforms happen in the midst of it. And what that does, we all know it practically as leaders in the church. If someone publicly is saying that, it gives us as individual church leaders permission to say it as well. It clears the space so that when you go out fundraising, everyone knows that this is the new standard. And it motivates all of you to be that public voice as well. If your leader, if your bishop is going out and clearing the space for it. Thanks.
The office of bishop is a very solemn calling, and I think it is one ultimately of oversight, of overseeing all of the ministries of the Greater Milwaukee Synod, including prophetic preaching, teaching, and abiding with the Lutheran confessions, raising up leaders, equipping congregations to be Jesus followers and to be communities who continue to make disciples and to follow a God in our world who is just and a God in whom we place our ultimate and only hope in times of brokenness. And of course, that means, standing with each other in our joys and in our sorrows, and standing in solidarity with communities and congregations and people who are without and who are suffering and who are seeking justice in the world on so many levels, particularly as we experience it here in our own synod. I think it is also in the office of the bishop the responsibility to be a fine and effective administrator, one who can pool together resources and assets in a collaborative way that is in keeping with the gospel message of Jesus Christ, and one who continues to realize the abundance that God is always offering us each and every day if we can only have our hands open to receive it. So as my colleagues have said too, it requires very intimate, I think, relationships with our leaders, with each other as communities, as disciples, as followers. Because ultimately it is not our hope in each other, it's our hope in God that transforms people. And I believe transform people, transform communities and neighborhoods and lives. And that is my hope for our synod as we continue to move forward here. I'm continually struck by Bishop Eaton's, Presiding Bishop Eaton's 4 tenets. We are church, we are Lutheran, we are church together, we are church for the sake of the world. I think if we can live into those realities in some very significant and accomplished ways, we will be very blessed as a result. Thank you.
The opportunities for public voice for a bishop, I've thought about a great deal. My doctoral work was in persuasive communication, which is how do words and language shape a community? And that can be creative and that can be destructive. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity from the office of bishop to keep sharing an ELCA perspective on those events that happen, on the dynamics that trouble us about the city of Milwaukee. I would like to see reactive messages from the office of the bishop when something tragic or something wonderful happens in the community, so that it becomes familiar. What is the ELCA response to this? And I'm struck looking out here and seeing some of our synodical pastors who have done that already. When Layla Peterson was shot on her grandfather's lap, Alexis Twido was there, and she walked with that family and still walks with that family. When Dr. Hamilton, a homeless man who was suffering with schizophrenia, was shot and killed in Red Arrow Park, Steve Jerby was there, and he brought friends to say this is not acceptable, and he continues to stand with that family as well. A statement from the office of bishop in response to things like mass incarceration, childhood poverty, racism in this city, and segregation, I think is really very important, and a real possibility that it could become predictable. What is the ELCA response here? Along with being reactive then, the opportunity to be proactive and to make sure that the public knows what our priorities are and what we would like to see happen in the city, in this region of southeastern Wisconsin going forward. So I feel very passionately about this, and I think the main opportunity here is for those who are not connected to faith communities now, seekers and nuns, to get to know a body of faith that is characterized by mercy, love, acceptance, justice. I am Jennifer Thomas, and being a public voice for the sake of the church on behalf of the world is one of my passions, and actually one of the things that has driven me into this call process against my better judgment. I think we need a strong voice from our pastoral leaders. I think that we need a common voice, and I think it's not just a voice that speaks on behalf of the church for the sake of the world, but then a voice that has listened carefully to the world's deepest hungers and speaks to the church. My concern for our church is that we are willing to look at things as half empty instead of half full. And I have said in my own discernment with my pastor back in Kansas, I'm a redeveloper. And if that's the kind of leader this synod wants, then I'm the person. But if it's about maintaining the status quo and saying that everything in the ELCA is just A-okay, I'm not it. I've always been a prophet. I've always been willing to stand in the gap and advocate for justice and mercy. It comes from my own sense of who I am as a baptized child of God. Those promises that were made for me on behalf of my family for me to strive for justice and peace in all the earth has propelled me into really uncomfortable places. And yet when I've gone there, I've felt completely at home. Things like walking in the rain with a nursing infant to advocate for immigration reform in this city because a friend said, we're going. And I said, I can't go, I have a baby. She's like, bring the baby, I'll walk with you. Things like advocating about low-income wage workers being employed as redevelopment money was being sought. Agitating the police department for video cameras. Telling Mayor Barrett, when he said in a conversation with me and a few other Micah leaders, well, that's something I'm going to get to in my second term. And I said without thinking, if you don't do this now, you might not get a second term. So I'm comfortable using my public voice, and often I find it's not just my voice, but the spirit that leads me forward. It's led me into places of advocating for full inclusion of LGBT people in the church. And I think right now the people we need to be advocating for as the church are refugees and imprisoned people, transgendered people who are being denied access to basic fundamental human rights like bathrooms. We need to speak up for the disenfranchised and the oppressed, and I am willing to do that by listening to you and finding out what's important to you in your context, and just show up with you when you say, we're going to march because this is important to our community.
Thank you, pastors. This kind of question is about Outreach for Hope. Outreach for Hope has been a part of the Greater Milwaukee Synod's mission for over 20 years. During that time, $3.5 million has been raised and distributed to congregations in low-income communities. These ministries have tremendous gifts to offer the whole church, but are limited in their financial resources to sustain their ministries alone. And here's the question. What role do you see Outreach for Hope playing in shaping the future mission of the Greater Milwaukee Synod? You different ones. Pastor Joy.
I have just come to know Outreach for Hope by participating in my first bike ride last summer. My daughter and I participated in the bike ride. And prior to that, because my congregation, Living Hope, I went to the list of participating congregations for the Outreach for Hope bike ride, and I was stunned that there were so many congregations that had not participated, because that's who I am. I think, wow, my congregation hasn't participated, I have to participate. And then I looked at my husband's congregation, Our Savior's in West Bend, and I'm like, they haven't participated. My daughter's a member of that congregation, we're signing both of them up. So she and I both rode in the Outreach for Hope bike ride. And I tell you that story because I feel passionate about that ministry, because it is such an important ministry in this synod. And I understand the impact and the extent of the ministry, and I wanted to make sure that my congregations and my husband's congregation, which are outside of the city and perhaps don't have as much exposure to Outreach for Hope as some of the other congregations, got to know a little bit more of the ministry for Outreach for Hope. And it's so impacted my daughter that she's now helping to organize an Outreach for Hope bike ride that's going to take place in Port Washington. But as a synod bishop, I can't imagine not having Outreach for Hope be an important partner in conversation and in planning, in envisioning, and in all the partners for Outreach for Hope. I would want to be a part of going to all of those congregations and those stakeholders to listen and to understand those ministries better, to be a part of that and understand fully that ministry, because it is huge and the work that you've done is so unique. In our entire church, there's not another ministry like it. And it's incredible. It's something that this synod should be so proud of. And I can't imagine anything but trying to figure out a way to enhance it, expand it, and grow it. It's it was a beautiful thing, that bike ride. I mean, in my 24 years of ordained ministry, what a beautiful thing. And as bishop, it would just behoove any bishop coming in to make sure that that ministry is understood, that a vision for it is firmly planted and seated and just continues. I don't claim to be an expert in it, as I just shared with you, because I'm new to it, but I can't imagine anything but trying to expand it, because it was such a beautiful experience, and the ministries and all the reading that I've done since about the impact is something to be celebrated, and certainly is of God. So thank you.
Yep, what she said. This morning, between all of the different tasks on the desk and the meetings that I went to, I was frantically trying to finish a letter. And it was a letter sent out to about, if I do a quick tally, it's about 40 households in my congregation that we had invited to an event last Thursday night. It was a cottage meeting to raise money for Outreach for Hope. And the letter I was working on today was to say, you really missed something if you weren't able to be there. And for those of you who were there, way to go. And we got to hear stories from All People's Church and about the difference that grant makes in their ministry. And for the people of Delafield, that's an incredibly exciting thing for them to hear about. And they were captivated as we spent time together and heard about the impact of Outreach for Hope, and they were thrilled to have an invitation to move beyond riding bikes to making commitments and to saying, yeah, we live in the western part of the city, but if we're synod, that means we're together. We're church together. And therefore, the prayer of Jesus for this Sunday's gospel is that they may all be one. If we're going to be one, if we're going to be synod, we live together, we church together, we do ministry together. So yeah, what she said.
I've spent a lot of time these last couple jobs I've had in the bishop's office in St. Paul and now with Agora, looking for funds to make good ministry happen. And I wish we had an outreach fund for Hope in Minnesota. There are other funds, but not organized in that same way. So if we didn't have one here, I'd look to create one. So I think it's an essential part of who we are as God's people, because let's face it, folks, we have enough to do what God is calling us to do, right? It's just finding a way to connect what we have with what our passions are and the change we want to see in the world. And an organization like Outreach for Hope, as I understand it, as it's grown over the years since I've been here, it provides that space. It provides that forum so that folks who really care deeply about something but don't know how to connect to it, they now can be connected to it. I've seen it happen most specifically with our global mission partnerships. In the St. Paul area synod, we've got partnerships in Tanzania and in Guatemala, and over $1 million a year goes overseas to support ministries around the world. And I think this is an opportunity to find ways to have those resources helping in changing lives right here at home. Because when those resources are allocated, it frees up other resources, not just money, but those passions and those times and those talents. It creates that space for God's Holy Spirit to work and to move in ways that none of us by ourselves can do. We need each other, and we need the power of the Holy Spirit to unite us.
I have a special affection with Outreach for Hope because my daughter, who's 10, she loves the stickers for Outreach for Hope because her name is Hope, and she loves that Got Hope sticker, and so she collects them and asks me, and then she puts them all over her door, so it's in my psyche. In my psyche for a better reason, though, because it is all about us working together, and the finances of Outreach for Hope compel a kind of strategy, mutual love, and working together that is the new church. It's weird how we often see money as an obstacle, right? Like, oh, it's so difficult, we don't have enough money. But the reality of what Outreach for Hope and the need for funds has done is it's compelled all of us together to get truly serious about the kind of reforms our city and our region need as church. I was talking with Bishop Jeff this last week, and we were talking about how in the city around us, my experience of ministry is one of sort of steady growth in all of the churches right around us. And I started listing off the congregations that were thriving with All Peoples and Hephatha and what's going on at campus ministry. And he stopped me and he's like, well, do you know what's in common in all those? Synodical mutual support. They are ministries of all of us. And there are many, many other stories. But when we are together and working together, we can do amazing things together. But when I talk to the leaders of Outreach for Hope and when we agonize together about what it is, one of the fundamental things that comes up is the need for public vision to clear the space and set a strong sense of leadership so that when we all go out fundraising, it's already on the tip of the tongues of the donors as to why this is so deeply important. So a public leader who casts that vision can help Outreach for Hope do what it needs. But ultimately, Outreach for Hope is not about its strategy that it can give to the church or about public leadership. It's ultimately, first and foremost, about the precious ministries that those places funded through Outreach for Hope serve. It's about the people that God has given us in our communities that need this mechanism so that we can truly bring God's work of love.
So in our Synod office, Executive Director Jim Bickle and I share a wall in between our offices, so we have a lot of frequent conversations about Outreach for Hope and how we can work together on this. Outreach for Hope, and we've been blessed with this ministry for the last 20 years, but it's on its way to being expanded, and there's going to be even greater dollars committed for this ministry. And you may have even seen the post of the new Director for Advancement that's just been posted, and so there's going to be an expansion of this ministry. What I'd like to see from where I sit as Director for Evangelical Mission is see greater collaboration with the Outreach for Hope dollars, which are, by the way, going to increase beyond $3.5 million to the 20 or so churches that receive those funds currently. But also, how do we collaborate more strategically with the ELCA renewal and New Start funds that 9 of our congregations get to do renewal and redevelopment work? As well as 2 new mission starts, one that's taking place at Felmers Cheney called Breaking the Chains Church, which you'll hear about at Synod Assembly, planting an ELCA New Start within a minimum security men's facility on North 40th and Fond du Lac. And then the table, which Venus Williams directs, which is adding word and sacrament ministry to some really fine ministry that she's been doing for a quarter of a century in our city, and dollars that are committed for that as well from the ELCA, as well as the Siebert Lutheran Foundation. And while we do a lot, I think, to have clear communication with each other, to make sure that we're collaborating well as partners, I think more can be done, and I would like us to challenge ourselves to do that in this next chapter together. I also want to just point out, too, that the Outreach for Hope board has been given the task of being one of the voices as we discern urban interns with some funds that came from a request from Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Milwaukee. And they're going to be a voice at the table about discerning how those funds will be used for that purpose for urban interns in our city. So I'm really excited about the expanded role Outreach for Hope will have.
I think I'm the only pastor of an Outreach for Hope congregation currently. I see several other pastors of Outreach for Hope congregations are also here. Redeemer Lutheran has received between $8,000 and $15,000 each of the last several years to support some of our ministries and some of our special projects so far. I also have to say that they really had our back when our boiler went out. We became known for the boiler campaign and the GoFundMe thing and the media attention and all that. I was called the boiler pastor for a while, but really Outreach for Hope came forward with a gift very quickly so that we could turn on the heat and thus have our ministries under that roof. I'm going to go real practical on you here because I know of some of the conversation that's happened within Outreach for Hope recently. I would really support seeing Outreach for Hope support urban interns, which has been mentioned, and also salary support for pastors. So many of our granting, if you're in the granting groove, it usually is about dreaming up a new project that's never been done before. So you pilot it, you hope it works. But really having the leadership there and solid and feeling confident about being able to be there the next year is super important. So I would like to see salary support, urban interns, and also this gets to that unsexy caretaking stuff. But when we were in our earlier days of turning around, what we really needed was a professional audit of our finances, and we needed a property inspection, and we even needed an appraisal to know what our physical plant was really worth. And that so often is the case with congregations that don't have a lot of funds. They think, well, can't afford that, can't afford that, can't afford that. And then the health of that congregation and that ministry, usually placed in a neighborhood like this one that needs ministry the most, can go down the tubes unnecessarily. So I'd like to see those things. Now, do I have enough minutes to tell you about something really exciting and so fun? 1 minute. Okay, so this year, Outreach for Hope is funding a program called Be the Change. And so just yesterday, we started our second beehive on the roof at Redeemer. And the program is taking guests who come to lunch at Redeemer, our noon run guests, and training them to be beekeepers. So we had our third class yesterday, and we donned all the equipment and we shook the bees in there. This will allow us to together learn the importance of bees to our ecology, so care for creation, and also economics, because we'll be harvesting, producing, and selling that honey later on. So that has been truly hopeful in the neighborhood. So I give a lot of thanks and credit to Outreach for Hope. Well, I am both Dave and Jim that I would like to work with them if I'm elected bishop. Both of them needled me a little bit after the last forum when we were asked about how we would construct our staff, and I, as many others did, talked about how we would staff with assistants for bishops, and we neglected all of the other partners on Synod staff. And Jim is a phenomenal fundraiser and community leader, and I've actually been asking him as I've encountered him at fundraising events throughout the past year if he was being called to be the bishop of the Synod, because I think he'd be an excellent bishop. But since he's not willing to do that, let's keep him as the director of the Outreach Fund. And the first thing I would do as bishop would be to ask him what role I could play with the Outreach Fund. I think that the bishop has a really important role, and I would compare it to the role of the president at the seminary, where I am a fundraiser. And while development and fundraising is part of the president's responsibilities, it's part of his responsibilities. And he just needs to know from us which donors he needs to be in relationship with this week, which events he needs to show up next month, to be a leader on call to raise money. And raising money is about having deep relationships with people around where the world's deep hunger is and where their great gladness meets that hunger. This is the place that we're called to be. The second thing that I would say is that I believe in the theology of God's abundance. And I think that's the message we have to share with the world around us, and to reject the myth of scarcity that's promulgated in our culture and even in our church. And that these relationships and communities and congregations that are funded by the Outreach Fund have so many gifts to offer, and that we're in this together. That's something that I would lift up. It's so important to remember as we're organizing for mission as a church, that our message is important, that people are important, and that money is important to do the mission that we're called to do. We're called to feed people and to transform lives by being present as ELCA ministries, whether it's a welcoming table, a congregation in a prison, a congregation like Incarnation in a neighborhood like this, or a new start. I would like to see us explore funding some training for pastors and lay leaders to learn how to be fundraisers, and maybe we could do that collaboratively together. I think the future is really exciting, and I'm glad too that the Synod has the Outreach Fund. It's a model for the rest of the church, and I think that's something that we can share with the ELCA. Thank you.
I hope that you are aware that whoever is called to be the next bishop of this synod will have to learn some things, will have to grow into the competencies that are specific to our life together. So I'm not going to take time today and say a lot about Outreach for Hope, except of course to articulate a commitment to better understand so that I can represent this great tradition here. I can say that I have been on the board of Carthage for 8 years, the board of LSTC for 8 years. I've been involved in 5 synods of this church, and in each of those calls and opportunities, I have engaged these kinds of conversations. And so I would tell you going forward that I would begin with the joy of assessing and hearing the stories, but also being open to the questions that may pertain to Outreach for Hope going forward, and also to enlarge the conversation about the resources that God has set before us as the Greater Milwaukee Synod. I don't want to take a lot of time on Outreach for Hope, but resources is my thing, and I look forward to being a part of conversations about resourcing this church for the ministry entrusted to it in this part of the world. Thank you.
Well, as you can see, we're blessed with some wonderful souls who have put their names forward, and we give thanks to God for each and every one of them. We are already running late, which is pretty typical for us in this reality, this forum. What we're going to do is we're going to take the shortest possible break. I want to take a 5-minute break. We're going to give a chance for those up front to stretch their legs, grab some water. We'll come get you in a few moments, but thank you for the first half. Now, for the rest of you friends, what's going to happen is anybody who has a question you'd like to write down, we're going to hand out index cards. You can write those questions down, turn them into any one of us, and we will then make that the substance of the second half of our time together. So, 5-minute break. You have a question, be sure to write it down. Get your hand up, and we will get cards to you. Thank you, pastors. We'll see you in 5 minutes.
Right on time.
It's now nearly 7:50. I've been asking us to reconvene for a couple minutes now. Let's do this, friends. We want to use this time effectively. I ask for you to refocus with me. So the next question will be for Pastor Lindsay. She'll be kicking us off in this round. I'm going to ask the rest of the room to please quiet down or to please step out in narthex. You can continue your conversations out there, but let's use this time effectively. I know, I'm being the guy pushing you. Interrupting conversations. I'm sure all the candidates are going, no, I don't want to do that, Pastor Berger. We want to keep it going, I get it. But that's not my role here. So, Lindsay, we're going to start with you, Pastor, and we want to start with this question. What step would you take to ensure that working to dismantle racism would be a priority for the Synod on all levels? Clergy, church professionals, congregations, and systems. This will be a 3-minute question, so there's plenty of time for reflection.
I think that goes right hand in hand with the question about public voice. You know, what's the public role of the office of bishop? You are given a platform at which to speak, and going beyond just the giving voice to the need to stand against racism, there's also action that's needed. We need voices to be constantly asking in all decision-making processes, what is it in this decision that we're making? What do we need to be thinking about from an anti-racist perspective? And how do we get those questions asked at the table when we're contemplating a decision about this or that or whatever it is? And also giving permission to those who can help us be the prophetic voices to keep that also in front of us. I think one of the biggest things, though, that needs to happen for a guy like me is to recognize my own white privilege, and to recognize that as a middle-aged, am I still middle-aged if I'm 49? Say thank you. You're saying the right thing. Okay, so, as a 49-year-old white guy, I know that even though my dad operated a little service station in Fertile, Iowa, a town of 400, there were still doors that were open for me that are not open for others, or at least as widely. And so that recognition, and as a prophetic voice and as a public leader, being able to give voice to that as a white middle-aged man, that helps foster conversations about anti-racism. I think voices like Marilyn Miller, Pastor Marilyn Miller, are very important. She has been a wonderful mentor for me in my 2 years in the Synod because of our relationship as partner churches. And she has allowed me to sit with her and to learn from her. And when she needs to challenge me, she says, and we talk. And she helps me see. And having those voices in your life, they matter. They matter. So there's something about being a public voice, about recognizing the privilege, about asking the questions all the time, and having people who will stand and walk with you in the journey. Those are just really critical to me.
In my own life, serving as a pastor in Chicago and on the near south side of Milwaukee and also in Minnesota, my life has been incredibly challenged and incredibly enriched by relationships with people who are very different from me, people who cross racial and cultural and language and lines. And so I think the fundamental aspect of becoming anti-racist is simply developing relationships and being encouraged, and sometimes strongly encouraged, to cross the lines and step out of our comfort zone and simply get to know people who are come to us from different backgrounds. That is the foundation, I think, of all of our work, is that we learn how to live in accompaniment with each other, to walk together on the road and to listen to each other's stories. Then I think the message of anti-racism needs to be such that it's consistent across all levels of the church. And we simply say, this is who we are as God's people. We value and respect the gifts of every individual, and we encourage us to somehow figure out the ways in which our own actions and behaviors have in the past and in the present and perhaps in the future inhibited other people from becoming whom God has created them to be. So we need to be diligent, we need to be clear, we need to be relational, and we need to celebrate the fact that God has given us diversity not as something that we need to be afraid of, or that we need to be afraid of offending another person, so I get myself painted in this smaller and smaller corner where, the political correct fear that some people have. Rather, we need to understand that this is a gift that God has given us, to get outside of ourselves, to get over ourselves, and to put away those behaviors and those attitudes and those beliefs and those structures that have kept people from being whom God has created them to be. This is true across racial lines, most certainly, but there's a whole lot of other areas in which our church and our society has forced people into boxes that need to be torn down, and we need to build true, living, life-giving communities of faith and reconciliation.
I'm indebted to the work of our Synod anti-racism team because they held me in a pretty tender time of my life. It was about 10 years ago, and I was going through the training, and my cousin, who's like a brother to me, I grew up with him my same age, who was adopted African American, had just died as a result of injuries he received as a soldier. And I was there in the midst of the anti-racism training and hearing all these things and all these stories and memories of my walking with him. He grew up in Northfield, Minnesota, classic Swedish progressive Lutheran household. And all of that wonderful tradition of thinking that if you were progressive and Lutheran, that you could solve all of the world's problems. And so they held Larry and we would walk together, and it didn't make sense to any of my family at the time when this cascade of events happened, the only African American kid in the community. And we'd be stopped at, going out shopping for random reasons. And I, in my naivete, thought it was me because I was from the city and not from Northfield. What I had to come to terms with is the deep reality that my own family had lived the systemic sin of racism. And I couldn't solve it with my mind or my progressive religion. One place that we need to start as leaders in the church is in a voice of confessing our inability to solve all these problems. It's the most hubris statement. And when I've begun personally to own that confession, and when I've walked with our community at Lake Park in naming openly that confession, it's the first time that we've actually been able to move beyond what is still a struggle at Lake Park, which is how white we really are. In the midst of it, I've seen the first sense of movement. So yes, as bishop, one would need to support all of this training and ministry and process, but a bishop needs to do more than that. A bishop needs to confess.
So we have a long way to go. I think this is one of the most challenging social issues of our time. I can remember growing up in Cudahy. I was a member of my home congregation originally was St. Mark's in Cudahy, and growing up during the summers of 1966 and 67 with the curfews and the challenge to be inside for fear of people walking up our sidewalk and street that would harm us, and the fear level was just amazing, and my own family's reaction to that level of fear was just disturbing. And I learned through my family how to be racist. I continued to be taught those kinds of values, and it really wasn't until, I think, seminary that I really came to full grips with what level of white power and privilege I had assumed and still do in my lifetime. I don't think we can ensure we can dismantle racism. I think only God can do that, but I think we have a big role. And one of the things I'm learning is we need to include people of color in the conversations and at the tables where we make important decisions and where we gather as church. And where we give voice to those who have previously been on the fringes or in some way do not benefit from the power and privilege that we assume as white leaders. And so one of the things we've already made as a requirement for rostered leaders is that they complete anti-racism training on a regular basis. We tell that to leaders who are assuming calls in our synod. And on various different levels as well, not just with Crossroads. Last week I was with a small group of leaders at a retreat center on 2 days called Race and Forgiveness, where we came to terms with our own internalized privilege as we grew up, and being able to offer ourselves forgiveness so we can offer others forgiveness. And coming to terms also with the institutionalized white privilege and power in our own institution as church as well. Those are real issues for us in our society today. And I pray God can continue to move us in some very dramatic and healing ways.
I think a key question is, in what ways have we been church in ways that contribute to or hold still a movement toward being less racist, honestly. I think we need to just come to terms with ways that we have been church, that we still are church, that privilege some over others. And that's going to be difficult for all of us. I'm pastor to a congregation that is in equal proportions, black, brown, and white. It wasn't always that way, but certainly in the last 6-7 years, it has grown to be a multiracial congregation. It also has a multiracial civic ministry called the Zeidler Center for Public Discussion. And several of the members of Kingo Lutheran have been trained as facilitators there. Just in the past, since the new year, we sponsored dialogues on Welcome to Whitefish Bay. I suggested they just call it Welcome to White Folks Bay, but I was shouted down on that. I live there. And also, we hosted at our congregation Interrupting Racism, which brought over 200 people from all over the city together that night at Redeemer. The New York Times was there to cover it as well. So what one step would I do as bishop? I would contract with the Zeidler Center for Public Discussion to try to set up as many possible conversations as we can, because I really do think that in addition to trainings, the real leverage is when people are close to one another. I always say proximity and friendship are the ways to get under and start loosening up our racist tendencies. Last year, I was talking to Fred Thomas Breitfeld, and he agitated me about being clear that I was an anti-racist person, and said, it's about time, Pastor, that you sign up to be part of the European Descent Lutheran Association. You already live out those values. Why haven't you made the commitment in a public way? It has been a joy in the last year to be part of that part of our Lutheran church, as we are called to be a multicultural church. There's an African Descent Lutheran Association, there's a Native American and Alaskan Indian Lutheran Association. There's so many tables that are created in the ELCA so that every culture has a voice and a welcome. And often when we think about multicultural ministries across the church, we don't consider the white culture a culture that contributes to the whole. Instead, we see it as the predominant culture, and then all of the other cultures are underneath that. And we need to shift the way that we're at the table. We need to walk alongside people of color with cultures other than ours. There's a movement in social media right now called I can't even say it, I can spell it better than I can say it, decolonizing Lutheranism. Old Lutheran says all kinds of crazy things about what it means to be Lutheran, and they're out of a white German or Scandinavian culture. That's not the only way to be Lutheran, and in fact, it's just a way to be a human. It says nothing about our theology. And so part of the social media campaign has been to say, if you have tacos for snack at preschool, you're Lutheran. If you enjoy covered dish dinners, you're Lutheran. And I was being kind of sassy one night late, and I'm like, if you like food, you must be Lutheran. But being anti-racist means submitting ourselves to being part of a larger culture that is God's culture centered in Christ, and letting go of things that we've defined as who we are as Lutherans. I thought that my family ate American food at my grandma's, and my church, when I moved to Kansas City, was having a Swedish smorgasbord. Will you come? And I was really excited. When I showed up, it looked like lunch at grandma's. Scandinavian food looks about the same. But it's not about food. It's about power and privilege and how we're going to use it to shape a better way to be people together. I would start by asking where people are at in their journey as rostered leaders and congregations in this conversation around racism. I was just at the Arkansas-Oklahoma Synod Assembly this weekend, and they had the Glocal musicians and an ELCA staff member named Sunitha, who did a wonderful job at talking about our cultures in the church, and that's another place to start.
When I was a little boy, we would travel from Robbins, Illinois, just south of Chicago, to Alabama every summer to visit my parents' families. And all along the way, we were given instructions. The further south we got. Remember, you're not up north anymore. Be careful when you go to the gas stations. There's a door that's going to say white and one that says colored. You go that way. The further south we got, the more intense this became. And so I want to say that my response to this begins with that reality of who I am and what my life has been like, and how I've always lived with what Du Bois calls the double consciousness, in order to survive, to be able to enter into the white world and navigate, shall we say, and to be authentic in a world that is not white, and that covers a lot of ground. So what I want to say is that, first of all, I find that often the anti-racism conversation is allowed to settle between the ears and never go farther. And we make it a task about getting the right ideas, the right jargon, speaking the right language, having the right statistics, but it never reaches the point of moving hearts. And when I say never, I'm not trying to denigrate any of the faithful work of our synod. It's just a reality that part of the distance we have to go, and a part of this question about how a bishop can make a difference, it's to push us to not make it all something that's about the cognitive, intellectual dissection of racism. I also want to say very clearly that we use the word "we" with unconscious prejudice, because it assumes that when you say "we," you're speaking for everyone. We have different experiences of this church, of this society. I do not need to make the same confessions that everyone at this table needs to make. But yet, as a church, we confess Christ. We confess that we are sinners. We confess that we cannot be the church without grace empowering us. So I will say this. There's a lot of resettling of how this works, so that our strengths and our progress is celebrated, and the things that we've missed because we don't have the courage or the wisdom or the vision are things that will have to change. It's got to get out from between the ears. It's got to get into your heart, and it's got to be about how you live and being willing to not be perfect in order to be faithful.
That's a hard one to follow. I'm a very relational person, and I am also a person who's not afraid to take risks and walk out where other people might think twice. And as I was listening to all of my colleagues speak, I was flashing back through a few things in my life where I was maybe first confronted with not being part of the dominant culture, or had experiences where I first questioned. One of them was when I was a very little girl, and my parents, we were coming home from some trip, and we were going through the Menominee Indian Reservation. And there was something going on where the Menominee Indians were protesting. And so they were throwing rocks at all the cars that came through the reservation, and they were actually pulling white people out of their cars. And I remember being terrified of that, not understanding that as a little girl, but understanding the great impression that made upon me at the time, of fear and of not understanding, and of just feeling that something was not right, and why was this happening. Another example of that feeling within me was back in Oshkosh, Wisconsin at the time, when you were in about second or third grade, they would do this little ethnic background thing. Raise your hand if you're this, raise your hand if you're that, because it was sort of assumed you could cover what everybody was in, a quick 3-minute assessment. And I remember the teacher saying, raise your hand if you're German. And every single person in the class, except for me, raised their hand. Which when you're that age was pretty, wow, I suddenly know what it is to be excluded and mocked at recess. Because I was the only non-German kid in all of the school suddenly. And then another example that raised that feeling in my gut of things, this just can't be how it is that we live together as Christians, early on in me, was in Oshkosh, they resettled a lot of refugees from Laos. So we had a very substantial Hmong population, and my home congregation took in many Hmong families. And I remember making friends with some of those Hmong kids, and I remember adults saying things to me at the time about that and how that wasn't okay. And so dismantling racism to me would mean that none of that stuff is okay. We have to be in conversation. We have to remember that we are all created in the image of God, every single one of us. And we need to be in intentional conversation. As bishop of the synod, I would insist that we're in that intentional conversation. The question had to do with clergy, church professionals, and laity. There's standards by which we unpeel together and repeat conversation. It's not just one time that we get a crack at it, but we're in this conversation for the long haul. And I would agree, we celebrate the progress, but we know we're not done. We keep at it. Thank you.
Here's a question of compassion, service, and piety. You're stopped at a light, and there's a man holding a sign saying, "Hungry, please help." What can you do? When you're ready, Pastor. 2 minutes, please.
Well, I think we've all had that experience and see it every day driving through the city streets of St. Paul. And how I personally respond is make sure that my resources go to help organizations that can provide assistance for folks who are going through hard times in their lives. One of the ministries that I helped get started in the St. Paul area synod is called Shobi's Table. And it's a ministry for homeless folks in St. Paul, and they have access to a food truck. So there's a food truck that parks on a street outside the Family Dollar Store on the east side of St. Paul once a week. And they give out free calzones or pocket hand pies and prayers and have Holy Communion there. And that is one of the ways in which the church is engaged in responding to these large and intractable needs of poverty. In terms of the compassionate response to folks that you meet day in and day out, what I at least try to do is acknowledge the other person's humanity. I don't necessarily roll down the window and hand a few dollars out every single time. Don't do that very often, actually, but I at least want to make sure that I acknowledge that other person's humanity. As pastors in many of our churches, there are lots of folks that come to our doors. We don't have to go out and find them. They come into our churches. And to acknowledge each person as a struggling child of God who is worthy of dignity and respect, that might be more valuable than the couple bucks that we're able to pass their way. So I'm trying to always treat other people as I would want to be treated.
On those days in which I do the right thing, which is not as much as I would like it to be, I would stop and ask them their name and get to know them. So much because I just realize how deeply my own preconceived notions of what makes the world right are often suspect, and what helps to ground and shape any sense of movement together is learning someone's name and understanding more deeply how we together are children of God and how we move. I want to say something larger, though. I was shocked in one of my... Lake Park has graced me with 2 sabbaticals over my 17 years there, and I'm deeply indebted to them for the wisdom in that. On one of the sabbaticals, my family and I have 3 kids, and my wife Jennifer, we went to Scandinavia, and we had the joy of spending 2 months in Scandinavia. And when I came back, the biggest thing I realized was I had not seen abject poverty for 2 months. And my spirit was rejuvenated in ways I could not imagine. Scandinavia has no more money than us. They have less than us. It's simply a choice as a culture to live a different, more egalitarian world. And at the core of that is 500 years of being bathed in an egalitarian faith. And it revived in me in a sense that our Lutheran words matter deeply. If they're proclaimed publicly, they can, in time, change civic reality.
I'm often guilty of not stopping at the stoplights and offering cash to those who hold signs that say, "I'm hungry," or "I'm in need of any help." I'm better at encountering people when they walk into a store or at the Walgreens to be able to hand over cash at that point, but I'm much more cognizant of the ways in which we can, on a larger scale, assist people who are homeless and in need while walking with some of our own congregational partners in our own Greater Milwaukee Synod as they offer shelter, food, food pantries, and any number of warming shelters and those things of that nature that we can help much more individuals on a regular basis. One of our requirements on our Synod staff is to do ministry reviews for congregations who are receiving ELCA partnership support. And so every 3 years we get an in-depth look and tour and walkabout with the leaders of those congregations in their neighborhoods, where they point out where homeless people will seek shelter or ask for food or come for clothing. And I believe that that is a much more efficient way of assisting greater numbers of people living in poverty and in need of food and shelter.
So very recently, the city of Milwaukee started this initiative called Keep the Change. Have you seen this? And stores and other places will put out signs that say keep the change. They're trying to encourage people not to give money to panhandlers. Similar to that, a dynamic that emerged a few years ago when we began a meal for anyone who is hungry at noon at Redeemer. We started out by serving it out on the front lawn. So that was right on Wisconsin Avenue. Hundreds of people go by all the time. And Marquette didn't take too nicely to the fact that we had all these people on display who needed a meal and didn't have the wherewithal to get it on their own right there in front of them. And I'd also received calls about what are we going to do about all these people standing around out in front of St. James Episcopal? Because they, with their bodies incarnate, are saying something is deeply wrong, and shame on a society where this is still happening, right? So this doesn't tell you anything about what I would do with the car, with the person that's standing there. But it does say that when we see people on corners, it's shameful. And if they aren't actually hungry, which is what we're often calculating, right? Are they really hungry, or are they just going to get enough money together to get their next fix of heroin or whatever else? Even if that person is standing out there looking for his next fix, that also shows shame on us for not having available adequate drug intervention and rehabilitation places. So would I give the money to the person on the corner? Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I think deeper relational connection and the Word of God in those moments when I'm sitting with people at that meal and connecting with them over what's going on in their lives, I think there's often more space there for God to enter in.
I'm probably a lot like you. I have different responses at different corners. Sometimes I park my car so that I can't see them, get them in that little blind spot, or sometimes I pray that the light will change. But no matter how uncomfortable I am in that moment, it's the tension between the way the world is and the way the world should be. And sometimes I have cash and can share. A lot of times my wallet is empty. I'm terrible at keeping cash in my wallet. Sometimes I've seen the same person at the same corner in my community, and I've gone to Subway, where you can often buy one sandwich, get one for the second one and half off, brought the sandwich back, and the person's gone. Sometimes I've been able to feed somebody. My daughter and I were walking downtown Milwaukee, or Kansas City. I never know where I'm at. And The first experience we had was parking at event parking, and it said $10 and I had $5, and the man said, "That's okay, you can park here, you look honest." And I then got out with my daughter who's 10, and we walked toward the event center that we were going to, and a man stopped us and asked us for cash, and I talked to him and I learned about him, and I said, "I'm really sorry, I just spent my last $5 at the parking." And he said, "That's okay, I just wanted to know if you could help me." And my daughter said to me, "Mom, I was so scared that you would talk to him. I was afraid he was going to rob us." Where did she learn that? I was stunned. He is just another human being looking for a hot meal on his road. There is probably 1 or 2 paychecks separating my family from the same kind of destitute poverty and homelessness if we didn't have the support network of our family and friends and the church that we love. So when I see a person on the sidewalk, I might feel like an but I see the face of Christ in that person.
This is something that comes up in my family often, and you should know that my wife and I have raised several of our grandchildren, and it's just really changed our lives and helps us to see more deeply what's at stake, not only what we do in church, but how our faith is with us when we're outside. So number one, we do say out loud sometimes, let's just bless that person, and we just do it. And we don't spend a lot of time parsing what's going to happen. We do that in restaurants too sometimes. It's just something that we do. We also maintain a connection with the organizations that are involved in a systematic approach to addressing hunger and poverty and human need and in the communities where we've lived, and right now in Kenosha. And it's important for our grandchildren to know where those places are, what they do, and to participate. That's a big part of it for me. The ELCA is part of ecumenical networks around the world that address poverty and hunger. And of course, there's the slogan, "Make Hunger History." You've heard that. That's what a lot of our money is trying to do. It's also important that we make hunger visible, because people will pretend that there's no hunger, or it's just an aberration to see someone in need. And so there's a way to do it with dignity, to recognize what the disparities in economics actually look like in our world. Finally, my grandchildren are aware of this man whose name is Mike, who looks like the poster child for a homeless person in Kenosha. Over the years, I've gotten to know Mike. He's never asked for money. And when I see him, if I have it, I always give him money and I talk to him. Our relationship has grown. I understand that Mike is where he wants to be, but we're becoming friends. And my grandchildren would say, "There he goes, aren't you going to stop?" Sometimes I do, sometimes I can't.
Driving by, I think that I too would be sometimes in a place of stopping and rolling down the window and offering money, and other times I would be, well, I'm in a rush, I got to get where I'm going, and not be, my heart wouldn't be very open to that. The question and the phrase that struck with me is compassion. I am probably compassionate to a fault most times. I take in all kinds of things into my home, people, animals, all kinds of things. So the compassionate piece of me wants to roll down my window and like give everything over. But I know that that's not the most helpful way, and that's not always the best way. I was thinking to myself, I probably should just start rolling down the window and giving out Outreach for Hope pamphlets and all kinds of service pamphlets that would be helpful. But I know that we have better ways to help, and we have better strategies often than just handing out the few dollars, that we have better programs, we have better resources, and we are stronger together in the bigger ways that we can help. So I too don't always stop. I too don't always roll down my window. Sometimes it is very mood dependent. I'm certainly not a perfect person in that regard, but compassion is a strength of mine, it's a fault of mine, and I would want to be a part of knowing all the programs that exist, or as many of them as possible, to find out what are our best strategies for helping, what are the best ways to equip people, and building relationships. My daughter, forever changed my view on that. When she was very little, we went to Chicago to see a musical, and there was a gentleman who was on the corner who wanted food, and we didn't have much time before the musical stopped, but she would not stop. And I said, okay, let's go buy him a sandwich. So we went and bought a sandwich. We came out and he was gone. We went to a musical a year later, and the same guy was there. She never forgot him, and she was like 9. She never forgot him, and it was the same guy in the corner. And we had talked about him all year, so we bought him a sandwich that time, and then we started talking to him. And we've seen him 3 more times since, and she's just had a profound impact on me in that regard.
My last call was in rural Wisconsin. I was privileged to serve as a pastor in a county by the name of Vernon, which is known as the second lowest per capita income in the state, second after Milwaukee County. And in a rural county, they don't stand on the street corners with signs, but they come into your church. And we had a regular community that we were working with in our community that would come for food through our food bank and come for clothing through the clothing closet that we started while I was there, and come to our weekly meals that were free, that were supported by the congregation. What do I do in Milwaukee? Oh, it really depends on the day, just like everybody here. It really does. As a leader, the voice of advocacy has always been a very important part for me, that even when I don't stop at the street corner and hand some food out the window, I have a voice. One of my favorite things that I've done as a pastor is when we are talking about world hunger issues in the congregation, we'll have a Sunday where every 6 seconds there'd just be a little tone that would play, ping, ping. And it was to signify that every 6 seconds somewhere in the world, somebody is dying of hunger. And the congregation wouldn't know what it was, and it would be so silent, but so just present enough that people could hear it. But as a way to illustrate and invite people into the processes of advocacy on behalf of hunger, and to invite generosity, especially into the ELCA World Hunger Fund.
I'd like to end this last forum the way I began them. With us is our outgoing bishop, Bishop Jeff. We say thank you for your service to this church, and we give thanks to God for your ministry among us. Let us say thank you. And we say thank you to these 8 souls up here. I've had the privilege of sitting through 8 or 4 of these with them. It just feels like 8. They are gifted in many different ways, and I give thanks for your ministries, and I know that God will bless us as this synod moves forward. Let us say thank you to them with a round of applause. We'll invite you to head out to the narthex. And on the narthex, you can be sure to greet them, to ask your questions, and interact with them as our evening continues on. Thank you once again to the pastor and people of Incarnation Lutheran. Appreciate your hospitality.